Ethan Hale, a former Navy SEAL, lived a secluded life high in the Rockies with his loyal dog, Shadow. He craved only silence after losing his wife, his child, and his very purpose in the world. But on the winter's harshest night, a desperate sound pierced the howling storm. The moment Ethan opened the door, a young mother collapsed into his arms. 4 freezing children clung to her, their breath ghosting then fading. He could not have known then that this one moment would drag him from the darkness and forever change the fate of everyone on his doorstep. Before our story continues, let us know where you're watching from. And if this story moves you, please subscribe for more tales of honor and sacrifice, and the bonds that can never be broken. Your support means everything. Snow fell upon the Rockies, a heavy, breathless weight, muffling the world in stillness. Ethan Hale woke even before the sound arrived. His body, sharpened by war and grief, stirred at the faintest shift in the night. For a long moment he lay still on the old cot, listening to the blizzard clawing at the window panes. Then it came once more, a soft, uncertain tapping, almost devoured by the roar of the winter storm. Shadow reacted first. The 6-year-old German shepherd, his black and tan coat streaked with the silver of old scars, rose from his post. At the foot of the bed, ears pricked sharply, his posture rigid, his tail low but alert. Shadow served beside Ethan through 2 deployments, bearing his own silent wounds of war. A slight limp on cold mornings, a soft whine when thunder mimicked the sound of mortar fire. He looked toward Ethan, his eyes full of questions. Ethan exhaled. "Yeah, I hear it too." He pushed himself up the cabin floor, ice cold beneath his feet. At 37, he still possessed the frame of a Navy SEAL, tall and broad-shouldered, the kind of man who once cut through deserts and war zones like a silent blade. But the hard angles of his face were now softened by loss. His dark blonde hair had grown out unevenly, and a coarse stubble shadowed a jaw that seemed permanently clenched in quiet restraint. A profound weight settled in his blue-gray eyes, the look of a man who had once loved deeply and suffered the price of loving in a world that takes more than it ever gives. The knock returned, 3 faint taps, then silence. No one ever climbed this far up the mountain, especially not in a blizzard. Ethan pulled on a flannel shirt, grabbing a flashlight, and walked to the door. Shadow tight at his heel, a silent protector. The moment Ethan opened the door, his world shattered. A woman crumpled forward into his arms. A young mother overwhelmed by hunger and exhaustion, her small frame nearly lost inside a torn gray winter coat. Her long dark hair, once straight, was now frozen stiff with ice. Snow clung to her eyelashes. Her cheeks were hollow, seemingly carved by months of unending fear. Her skin, fair yet wind-battered, was almost gray in the lantern's light. She clutched a toddler to her chest, a little girl no older than 2, wrapped in a damp blanket, her lips pale blue, her limbs stiff from the cold. Behind her stood 3 more children, a girl around 9, tall for her age and thin as a reed, with tangled chestnut hair and eyes far too old for a child. She held fast to the hands of 2 small boys, twins maybe 6 years old, identical in their shuddering, their chapped lips, their mismatched clothes. All 4 of the children were shaking violently, their breath clouding the air like frightened sparrows. Her lips moved, but no sound escaped, only a fragile, ghost-like whisper. "Please." Ethan's response was instant. "Get inside," he commanded, his voice steady, laced with urgency. He swept the woman up in one arm, the small child still fused to her side, and carried them toward the cabin's safety. The older girl and the twins stumbled after them, crossing the threshold, as if stepping from a frozen hell into a new world. Shadow moved toward them, a silent guardian, his nose low and his tail giving a soft, reassuring sweep. The children instinctively pressed together, but there was no threat in him, only a quiet assessment as he circled them, once his gaze passing over each small face like a silent, furry medic. The cabin's air was brutally cold, yet it was a world away from the storm's fury. Ethan moved with purpose. He wrenched the stove door open, feeding it seasoned logs and working the bellows until a roar of flame clawed its way to life. A sudden dancing light illuminated his world rough-hewn timber walls. A small table flanked by two mismatched chairs, shelves holding a sparse collection of cans, a kettle steaming softly on the stovetop. "Sit here," Ethan directed, ushering the children toward the growing warmth. The mother collapsed into the nearest chair, her arms a vice around the toddler, her breathing a painful, ragged rhythm. The older sister guided the twins to the hearth, her small hands rubbing their frozen fingers with a practiced, heartbreaking maturity. Ethan knelt by the toddler, his large hand gently sweeping damp hair from her brow. Her weight in his arms was terrifyingly slight, her skin as cold and unforgiving as a river stone. Hypothermia. He breathed the word, a grim diagnosis. Years of combat medicine surfaced, guiding his hands. He swaddled the child in one of his own thick wool blankets, gently chafing her limbs, searching for a pulse, pressing his palm to her chest, desperate to feel a flicker of inner warmth. Shadow laid himself down beside the child, a living furnace curling his great body around her. Her tiny fingers instinctively tangled in his thick fur. Ethan's gaze met the mother's. She was watching his every move, her eyes wide, vacant pools of fear. They were hazel eyes that must have once sparkled, now just hollowed out rings of exhaustion and terror. "My name is Sarah," she finally whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing. "Sarah Brennan." Each word she spoke next was carried on a tremor. "Our car, it just died on the road. We walked for half a mile. The baby, Lily, she just stopped crying and I thought..." Her voice shattered, and she covered her mouth, choking back a sob. Ethan shook his head, his tone firm but gentle. "You did everything right. Let me handle it now." He moved to the shelf, retrieving the last of his own emergency supplies. 2 military ration packs and a half-empty jar of peanut butter. The twins attacked the food with a feral hunger that spoke of days without a real meal. The older girl ate with more restraint, her gaze locked on her mother, a silent promise. Sarah watched them, her own hands shaking uncontrollably. It wasn't until Ethan set a bowl of warm broth before her that a fraction of the tension left her body. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, the sharp edges of their breathing began to soften. In the firelight, a shelter built for one man and his dog now held the fragile, fluttering pulse of a family. And Ethan Hale, a man who had come to this wilderness to vanish, felt an unfamiliar thawing deep within his chest, like a frozen landscape trying to recall the sun. As the toddler's breaths grew steady under Shadow's protective warmth, Ethan finally understood. His life was no longer his own, and the desperate sound that had shattered his solitude was not an end but a beginning. By morning the storm had broken, but the bitter cold remained, clinging to the cabin walls like a persistent, silent threat. Ethan Hale moved with the silent purpose, tending the fire and checking on the 4 children huddled together in sleep near the stove. Shadow lay beside them, the German shepherd's deep breaths serving as a comforting barrier of warmth. The children had instinctively shifted toward the dog, his fur tousled, carrying the faint scent of snow and ash. His deep brown eyes were half open, ever watchful even in sleep. Ethan had seen years of war, yet nothing felt as fragile as this moment. 4 small bodies mending from a night that could have claimed them. He exhaled a long, quiet breath. He then glanced toward the room's only chair where Sarah Brennan sat, huddled, a thin wool blanket draped over her slight shoulders. In the faint morning light, she seemed even more fragile than before's. Her long, dark hair, now finally dry, fell in uneven waves against her pale cheekbones. Her face, hollowed from weeks of inadequate meals, held a quiet beauty born not of ease but of sheer endurance. She sat with both hands cradling a chipped mug of warm water, staring into the void. Ethan approached. "You warm enough?" She nodded, though a faint tremor in her fingers revealed the truth. Sarah had the look of someone held together by will alone. A thin woman in her late 20s, back straight, despite the exhaustion, eyes bruised with worry but fiercely vigilant. "I am so sorry," she murmured, her voice low. "We've taken your bed, your food, your heat. I didn't want to." "You did what you had to," Ethan said gently. "That's what parents do." Her gaze drifted toward the children, softening in a way that made a knot form in Ethan's chest. She'd survived freezing nights, empty cupboards, and the harsh judgment of strangers, yet her gaze on those 4 little ones held only tenderness, no trace of bitterness. Ethan moved about the cabin, gathering what few blankets he had left. As he lifted one, something slipped from the pocket of Sarah's coat, a small, thin folder, with curled edges landing on the floor with a soft thud. Sarah froze. Ethan bent and picked it up, seeing the label. "Infant found. Trailer Park District." He slowly looked up at her. Sarah's breath stuttered, her fingers clenching the mug until her knuckles were bone white. "It's not what it looks like," she whispered. "I'm not thinking a thing." Ethan said, his voice steady. "But if there's something you need to tell me, now is the time." Sarah bowed her head, her hair falling like the curtain around her face. For a beat, she just breathed, debating whether she could trust him. When she finally spoke, her voice cracked in the middle. "Lily isn't mine." Ethan didn't stir. Sarah swallowed hard. "My husband and I lived in a worn-out mobile home. We didn't have much, but we had the children and we still had hope." She took a ragged breath. "Then one night about a year ago, I heard crying. I went outside and there she was. Lily, wrapped in a thin towel right beside a dumpster. She couldn't have been more than a few weeks old. No note, no name, not a soul in sight." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I went to every door in that trailer park. No one claimed her. Some said to leave her on the church steps. Some said the police wouldn't care. One woman even said to me, 'Not my problem.'" A quiet, trembling anger hardened Sarah's voice. "But she was a baby, freezing and alone. So I brought her into our home, and from that night on, she was mine." Ethan sat on the table's edge, the folder resting in his hands. The weight of it felt impossible for mere paper. He saw it all in Sarah's face, the terror, the humiliation, yet a fierce, unbreakable loyalty. This wasn't a woman fleeing her past choices. This was a soul in flight from a world that had betrayed her at every crossroad. Clutching her own chest, Sarah's voice broke the silence. It changed me. I thought I knew what being a mother was with 3 of my own. But Lily, she gave me that feeling all over again, like I was being given a second chance to truly get it right." Her words dropped to a raw whisper. "And then my husband passed. The landlord threw us out, and every door we knocked on was slammed shut. I made a vow I wouldn't lose her, not any of them." Ethan stared into the flames, his jaw tight, fighting back a silent storm of emotion rising within him. He understood the hollowness of losing family. He knew the soul-crushing weight of fighting to save someone only to fail. Yet Sarah, this fragile, weary woman, had rescued a child who wasn't even her own blood. She had shepherded 4 children through blizzards, starvation, and shame, all because her spirit refused to let them go. Shadow raised his head, nudging Sarah's knee with a gentle moan. Her hand found its way into his thick fur, an unconscious comforting gesture. It was a touch that spoke of years, not hours. At last, Ethan's voice cut through the quiet. "You're stronger than you know, Sarah. Stronger than almost anyone," he added, his voice low. A single tear traced a path down her face and she let it fall. He placed the folder on the table. "Lily is safe now. They all are." Sarah managed a nod, her shoulders shaking with a relief too deep for words. For a long, suspended moment, the only sounds were the fire's gentle crackle and the peaceful breaths of sleeping children. Ethan's gaze swept across the room, landing on Shadow, a silent guardian, then on the children cocooned in blankets that carried the faint scent of pine, and finally on the weary woman who bore a weight no soul was ever meant to carry. A profound shift occurred deep within him, like the tectonic plates of his own world settling into a new alignment. These weren't just refugees seeking cover. They were a family teetering on the brink, and he unintentionally had become the one thing holding them together. For 3 days, the storm raged and relented in cycles, but within the cabin's walls, a delicate warmth started to grow. The air was still laced with the bitter sting of winter, but the presence of 4 children and their mother's quiet resolve had altered the very rhythm of Ethan Hale's solitary existence. The little cabin, once a place of hollow echoes, was now filled with the gentle patter of small feet, the soft lullabies Sarah would hum to herself, and the constant reassuring tread of Shadow's watchful patrol. By morning, the cabin felt less like a shelter and more like a sanctuary. Sarah Brennan, though still gaunt with exhaustion, possessed the relentless drive of someone forced to rebuild from ashes too many times to count. Her dark hair, still wild from the blizzard, was now drawn back in a simple braid, exposing the sharp, graceful lines of a face carved by adversity, but never broken by it. She swept away the dust of neglect, armed with Ethan's old toolbox to silence a rattling hinge, and she washed their few dishes in water, melted from snow warmed on the stove. Each motion was quiet, yet deeply intentional, as if she were reclaiming this space as a home with or without his permission. The children filled the silence that had long been king here. Lucy, the 9-year-old, carried a solemn gravity, her watchful eyes constantly scanning a fierce little guardian for her siblings. A messy fringe of chestnut hair was perpetually falling over her brow, and her soulful brown eyes absorbed every small change in the cabin. She shadowed Ethan through his chores, asking about firewood and kindling with a gravity that defied her age. The twins Sam and Ben were the first to thaw. They tore through the cabin in clumsy bursts of energy, their identical grins flashing when Shadow nudged them with his cold nose. The 6-year-olds had the wiry limbs of kids used to calling the back seat of a car their bed, but their laughter, so new and hesitant, filled spaces Ethan thought had fallen silent forever. Lily, the youngest, remained glued to Sarah's side by day, but burrowed into Shadow's warm fur each night. Her tiny hands would often grasp his ears softly, as if terrified he might simply disappear, and Shadow, for his part, accepted his post with the gravity of a sworn protector. His dense coat, finally clean and cared for, shone in the fire's glow, and his amber gaze would soften the moment a child crawled onto him. Ethan watched all of this with a mix of awe and guilt. He had not meant for their presence to feel this good, yet it did. He found himself teaching Sam and Ben how to properly stack firewood, guiding their small hands with a patience he thought was lost to him. He showed Lucy how to twist pine shavings into tinder bundles, her brow furrowed with deep focus. Even Lily seemed to sense that something had shifted. She would toddle after him, on her unsteady legs, holding a wooden spoon like a royal scepter. But the warmth of these fragile moments couldn't hold back the cold truth waiting just outside. Beyond the mountains, the world had not stopped, and it was closing in on him. A folded property tax bill sat in his coat pocket, a discovery he'd made the morning before, unearthed from a pile of mail he had deliberately ignored for too long. The number printed on it had stolen the very breath from his lungs. He owed what he could never have. Years of unstable work, the medical bills from his wife's final days, the bills for his own quiet battles, and the cost of saving Shadow's leg had completely erased the savings he once possessed. His part-time security checks were never going to be enough. His old Navy equipment, the little he'd kept, was worn and not worth much. And the cabin with all its rough edges was the last piece of his life the world hadn't already claimed from him. That night, after Sarah settled the children into bed, Ethan stepped outside, needing to clear his head. The sky sagged low, the stars buried behind bruised clouds. Snow crunched under his boots as he breathed in deep, letting the biting cold steady his frantic heartbeat. When he returned inside, Sarah was sitting at the table, all alone. Her posture was rigid, as if she were bracing for a moment she absolutely dreaded. She reached into her worn coat and set something small on the table. A ring, a plain gold wedding band, its luster faded by years of wear, but unmistakably precious. Its weight on the rough wood felt immense, as if it carried not metal but the weight of memory. Ethan's chest grew tight. "Sarah, no." She held up a trembling hand. "Please, just let me finish." Her hazel eyes, clouded with loss, met his with a rare, unwavering strength. "This was Daniel's," she said softly. "My husband's. It was the only thing I could keep when the landlord forced us out. I've held on to it because it felt like the very last piece of him I had left." She paused, breath shaking. "But my kids are alive now because of you, because you opened your door when the world shut theirs. If selling this can help you keep this cabin, help keep them warm, then I need you to take it." Ethan's hand met hers gently, pushing the ring back. "Sarah, this isn't yours to give away." Her voice trembled. "It's the last thing I have to offer. You've already offered everything," he said softly. "You walked for miles through that storm. You carried 4 children when you had nowhere else to turn. You don't owe me a thing." Tears began to fill her eyes, blurring his face. She pressed her lips together, fighting to hold herself together with every ounce of her will. "Then how will you save your home?" she breathed. Ethan had no answer for her. The silence that hung in the air wasn't cold. It was heavy, aching, and deeply human. Sarah's hand closed over the ring, pulling it to her chest, as if she was taking back a part of her own heart. And Ethan realized the coming days would test them all in ways he couldn't begin to fathom. 4 days after Sarah offered her wedding ring, and Ethan had gently refused, the storm finally gave way. A pale sun struggled through the low-hanging clouds, casting a cold silver glaze over the snow-dusted pines. The world looked peaceful, almost forgiving, but Ethan Hale was anything but calm. The tax notice felt like a stone in his pocket, and no amount of chopping wood or finishing chores could drown out the harsh reality. He was out of time. He hated the thought of leaving the cabin not with Sarah's hope stitched together by the thinnest of threads. Yet by midday he was firing up his old truck, clearing the snow from the windshield. He prepared to drive down the winding trail to town. Shadow watched from the porch, his tail hanging low, sensing Ethan's inner turmoil, as only a loyal companion could. The shepherd was broad-chested and formidable, despite his aging legs. His thick coat caught the glint of the sun. He let out a low rumble, not of aggression, but of deep concern, nudging Ethan's leg, begging him to stay. "I'll be back," Ethan promised, softly scratching behind the noble dog's ears. "You watch over them." Inside the cabin, Sarah Brennan stood balancing Lily on her hip. The toddler's cheeks, finally flushed with a healthy pink, showed the cabin's returning warmth, and she buried her small face into her mother's slender shoulder. Sarah's dark hair was woven in a loose braid down her back, a stark contrast against the pale skin pulled taut over her cheekbones. She still looked exhausted, still looked afraid, but the raw desperation from that first night had begun to fade. Stepping onto the porch, she watched Ethan, her eyes filled with worry. "Do you have to go today?" she asked softly. Ethan nodded, forcing a resolve he didn't feel into his voice. "If I don't meet with the assessor now, I'll lose my chance before the deadline hits." Sarah bit her lip, her hands tightening protectively around Lily's little body. "Be careful. The folks in town, they aren't kind to outsiders." A moment of silence passed. "And they especially don't like me." Ethan held her gaze, his own unwavering. "Then I'll speak on your behalf." She blinked, surprised by the certainty in his voice. Before she could respond, Ethan climbed into the truck, and the engine roared to life with a groan. Snow flew from the tires as he drove off, leaving the small cabin, and the family he'd sworn to protect shrinking in his rearview mirror. The town of Miller's Pass was nestled deep in a wide valley, its single main street flanked by old brick buildings and a diner with a sputtering neon sign, and a grocery store hiding beneath a sagging wooden awning. Towering behind it all, the mountains rose, watching silently as the town endured another winter. As Ethan stepped into the county office, a bell over the door chimed sharply. Behind the counter, Miss Janet Merrill presided, a woman in her late 50s, with a spine as unbending as winter ice and hair pulled back so severely it seemed to ache. Her reading glasses were perched on the bridge of her nose, her eyes peering over them, fixing Ethan with the tired, unwelcoming gaze of a person who despises the unexpected. "Mr. Hale," she declared, her voice as crisp as the winter air. "You're late." "I'm within the grace period," Ethan countered, his jaw clenching. "Barely," she shot back, shuffling papers with sharp, dismissive movements. "Your request for an extension has been reviewed. Denied." The word landed like a blow, and Ethan could only stare as a hot wave of disbelief washed over his face. "Ugh. But I haven't even had a chance to speak with the assessor." "No need." Miss Merrill slid a stamped document across the counter. "Your payment is due, in full." He swallowed against a rising tightness in his throat. "And if I can't pay today, then the property enters pre-seizure status." His hands balled into fists, then released. "Look," he pleaded. "I've had some complications. I just need a little more time." Janet simply lifted her chin, a gesture of pure dismissal, her eyes narrowing to slits behind her spectacles. "Complications? Like taking in that Brennan woman and her brood." A shard of ice seemed to trace its way down Ethan's spine. "What did you just say?" She just tapped her pen against the worn countertop. "The whole town is talking about it. A woman with 4 children appearing on your doorstep half frozen. Utterly reckless, deeply irresponsible." Ethan took a step closer, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous pitch. "She walked through a blizzard to save her children. Irresponsible isn't the word I'd use." Janet's lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line. "Well, the town has its opinions." "And most of them," Ethan cut in, "aren't worth the air it takes to speak them." Before the biting retort could leave Miss Merrill's lips, the door behind her swung open, and Deputy Alan Reeves stepped inside. He was broad-shouldered in his late 40s with a tidy salt-and-pepper beard and a uniform that pulled just a bit too tight at the seams. His face was a map of too many long winters and too many falsehoods. But beneath the stern exterior, a weary kindness lingered in his brown eyes. "Hale," Reeves greeted, his voice steady. "Heard you've run into some tax trouble." "More than some," Ethan confessed as Reeves's gaze swept over him, taking in the rough stubble on his jaw, the frayed flannel, the unyielding stance of a man fighting both the elements and the judgment of others. He let out a heavy sigh. "Wish I could help you, son, but the county's not bending. Not this year." Ethan drew a slow, deliberate breath. "Yeah, and I figured." But as he turned to walk away, Janet's sharp voice cut through the air. "A word of advice, Mr. Hale. If you have any hope of keeping that house, perhaps you should stop collecting strays." Ethan froze his back to her. "Say that again," he said, his voice dangerously soft. Janet blinked, surprised by his intensity, but she held her ground, unrepentant. "Strays, you can't afford them." Ethan turned and stepped toward her, his voice even but burning with a fierce light. "That stray, as you call her, Dainhoy kept her children alive when not a single soul would lift a finger to help. If you truly believe that compassion is a liability, then maybe the problem isn't with her." Reeves cleared his throat loudly, stepping in to break the tension. "Let it go, Hale. It's not worth the fight." But it was worth something. To him, it was worth everything. When Ethan finally returned to the cabin hours later, defeated and empty-handed, he discovered Sarah on the floor, by the warmth of the stove, the children huddled close around her. Her head snapped up the moment he entered, her eyes reading the devastating truth on his face before a single word was spoken. "They said no, didn't they?" she whispered, and he could only nod. A heavy silence fell between them, thick with unspoken fears. Then slowly, Ethan knelt down before her, his hands trembling, but not from the cold. It was the weight of a monumental decision forming in his heart. "Sarah," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "you and the children, you have no legal protection here. If something were to happen to me, if the county seizes this cabin, You'll all be homeless again." Her breath caught in her throat, a sharp, broken sound. He went on, "But there's a single way to keep you safe. One way to ensure no one can take this home from you." Sarah stared, her eyes shimmering with a fragile, fearful hope. "Ethan, what are you saying?" He drew a ragged breath. "I'm asking you to be my wife, not for romance, but for responsibility, for what's right." He held her gaze unwavering, "Because I have to protect you, all of you." Tears streamed down her face as a trembling hand flew to her mouth. "Yes," she breathed, a whisper that sealed their fate. "Ethan, yes." And in that small cabin, where warmth had reclaimed both the air and their souls, the foundation of a new family began to settle. 2 weeks vanished in a whirlwind of paperwork and preparations, of frayed nerves and a strange anchoring sense of belonging. Winter was finally losing its iron hold on the Rocky Mountains, and slivers of sunlight pierced the retreating clouds, a promise of what was to come. The cabin, once a quiet refuge for one man and his aging dog, now pulsed with the restless energy of a family bracing for a new beginning. The morning of the wedding dawned crisp, the air thick with the scent of thawing earth and melting snow. Ethan Hale stood before the small mirror hanging crookedly on the cabin wall, adjusting the collar of the only dress shirt he possessed. He remained every bit the soldier, tall, broad-shouldered, his jawline strong, beneath a short, neat beard he'd carefully trimmed the night before. But there was a new light in his blue-gray eyes, a softness that defied the brooding silence that had been his armor for years. It was hope, fragile and uncertain, but undeniably there. At his side, Shadow sat in attentive stillness, a silent guardian watching his master. His tan and black fur was brushed to a sheen, and someone, likely Lucy, had tied a small white cloth around his neck like a makeshift bow tie. At 6 years old, the German shepherd had the quiet dignity of a seasoned protector. The faint limp in his right hind leg was more pronounced on cold mornings, a lasting scar from a blast far across the sea. But this day he moved with a profound sense of purpose. Today his pack was growing. Outside, Sarah Brennan smoothed the simple cream dress Janet Merrill had left for them after hearing of the wedding. The woman had delivered it with a rigid formality that couldn't quite mask a flicker of apology in her eyes. It was an unexpected, powerful gesture. Sarah now stood bathed in a shaft of morning sun, her slender frame held tall with a newfound pride. Dark hair fell down her back in loose curls that Lucy had painstakingly created with melted snow and their one comb. Her hazel eyes, so recently dimmed by bone-deep weariness, now glowed with a warm and steady brilliance. The children were gathered around her like precious mismatched charms. Lucy, her firstborn, wore a faded blue dress from a neighbor standing tall by her mother, ever the watchful protector. Sam and Ben pulled at the collars of their stiff shirts, two restless kernels of identical energy and wide, infectious grins. And sweet Lily cradled in Sarah's arms, her little fingers woven into the fabric of the dress, her cheeks flushed pink with excitement and the gentle glow of returning health. Ethan joined them, and for a heartbeat, all sound faded away. Sarah looked up, her breath catching softly, as though she was seeing him not merely as the man who had rescued her family, but as the man who would be their anchor in every storm yet to come. "You look," she began, her voice a tender whisper. A nervous catch in his throat, Ethan asked, "Presentable?" A light, genuine laugh escaped Sarah. So much more than that. Together they walked the short distance to the town hall, where Reverend Stone awaited a man in his early 60s with gentle features, silver hair, and a face lined by years of offering guidance to souls who rarely listened. His voice carried the comforting cadence of a seasoned pastor, his eyes holding a kindness that was a quiet refuge, not a loud sermon. A few town residents had gathered, some moved by curiosity, others by a sense of duty, and a handful by genuine care. Mrs. Bided stood rigid in the front row, her lips pursed but offering no objection. Deputy Alan Reeves stood against the back wall, arms crossed, offering a single affirming nod when his gaze met Ethan's. Even Janet Merrill appeared lingering by the doorway, her posture stiff, but her expression softened by contemplation. Reverend Stone commenced the service, his calm voice weaving a narrative of resilience and of compassion, and of the unforeseen paths to finding sanctuary in one another. Ethan's gaze was anchored to Sarah's. Her hands trembled, but her eyes held firm. As Stone invited Ethan to speak his vows, his voice faltered for a single fleeting heartbeat before he took a breath and began. "I can't promise I'll always have the right answers," he said, his voice low and clear. "But I swear you'll never face another storm alone. And I promise," his voice softened, "to protect this family with every last breath I have." But before Sarah could answer, a tiny figure squirmed free from Lucy's arms as Lily lurched forward on wobbly legs, her arms stretched toward Ethan. "Papa!" she squealed. A collective gasp quickly became laughter. Sarah pressed her hands to her mouth, tears of pure joy streaming down her face as Ethan knelt and swept Lily into his embrace. She clung to him, burying her face against his heart, and he shut his eyes, overcome by an emotion so vast it stole all the words from his throat. Reverend Stone smiled warmly. "I think the little one approves." Sarah's vows were simpler still, spoken through tears. "You gave us a home when we had nothing. I promise to stand with you wherever this life takes us." Stone pronounced them husband and wife, and Ethan kissed her, a brief trembling kiss heavy with gratitude, fear, and a quiet, burgeoning love. Spring came tentatively at first, then all at once as the snow yielded to thick mud, which dried into soil rich and dark with promise. Together they rebuilt the chicken coop and mended the leaking roof, and planted a humble garden with rows of potatoes, beans, and carrots, each carefully covered with straw. The children worked alongside them, their laughter a bright echo against the mountains. Shadow was Lily's constant companion, the toddler, saved once from the bitter cold, and again by the love that claimed her, followed the devoted dog with an unwavering adoration. He patiently endured every pull of his fur, every clumsy embrace, and every offering of imaginary soup served on a stick. On a warm afternoon, Ethan and Sarah walked to the small cemetery behind the cabin, where two graves rested beneath an old pine, the final resting place of his wife and infant son. Sarah knelt, placing a wild flower on the smooth, cold stones, and whispered something lost to the breeze. Ethan stood at her side, his hand finding hers. He was not replacing his past. He was honoring it even as he chose a new future. That evening the family gathered on the porch as sunset painted the sky in gold and rose. The children lay peacefully at their feet, Shadow dreaming with his head in Lily's lap as Sarah rested her own against Ethan's shoulder. "Do you ever think," she murmured, "that winter brings things for a reason?" Ethan's breath escaped him in a slow, quiet sigh, his gaze lost on the mountains melting into silhouettes. "Yeah," he whispered back. "Some winters break us, others remake us." He wrapped an arm tightly around her. "And this one gave me everything. The greatest miracles often come in the quietest of ways, not as shining angels with wings of gold, but as an ordinary person knocking on our door in the middle of a terrible storm, or as the silent strength God plants in our souls when we believe we're completely broken." Ethan believed winter had stripped him of everything. Sarah was sure the world had turned its back, but Grace found them still carried on the sound of a single fragile knock, a shivering child, a devoted dog, and the quiet bravery to answer a knock when every fiber of your being urged you to stay locked away. Miracles don't always have to split the sky. Most often they bloom with a quiet grace in the places we least expect them, within a small cabin, in tired, caring hands, in the grace of second chances, and in the families born of love, not just of blood. And perhaps God's hand was guiding them toward one another this entire time. If this story managed to touch your heart, I invite you to share it with anyone who needs a reminder that hope finds a way even through the harshest of winters. Please leave a comment below. Tell us what moved your heart the most. and subscribe to this channel so you won't miss our next story of enduring courage, profound kindness, and of God's quiet miracles. May God bless you, always protect your home, bring warmth to your soul, and guide your heart to the miracles waiting for you just beyond the door.